So this UNRWA incident is effectively a way of bypassing the order through the actions of other states. Okay, so committing genocide, continuing the genocide, but not through Israel, through other states. So when Israel has to report back in a month to the ICJ, it's not going to report on the actions taken by these other allies to effectively starve the Palestinians to death because of the disbanding of UNRWA and not providing any money to it.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal, and the genocidal warfare in Gaza is continuing as we speak, and hundreds of Palestinians are dying daily from the mass atrocities committed by Israel. Last Friday, even the International Court of Justice, the United Nations' highest judicial body, ruled that there is credible evidence for fearing that Israel might be in the midst of committing genocide, prompting the court to mandate provisional measures that call on Israel to ensure that mass dying will not continue to occur. On the same day, however, Israel started accusing 12 employees of UNRWA, the UN organization primarily responsible for delivering humanitarian aid to Gaza, of complicity in the October 7th attack, which by now led to the US, UK, and 7 other European nations halting all funding for the relief organization. An organization that I must recall employs 13,000 people and is the only one that can potentially stop a famine and disease from killing even more civilians indiscriminately. This situation is beyond cruel. It's pure injustice. To discuss this most horrible human rights situation, I've got with me Dr. Ilyas Bantekas, the man who wrote the Cambridge textbook on human rights that I'm using in my classes. Dr. Bantekas is professor of transnational law at the Hamid bin Khalifa University in Doha, Qatar. He has authored more than 200 peer-reviewed articles in the best international law journals in the world, and his books have been published by Oxford and Cambridge University presses. Those are the best publishers like ever in our field. Dr. Bantekas, thank you very much for coming online.
Thank you.
Dr. Bantekas, before I ask you any specific questions, could you maybe tell me how you are interpreting what is currently going on in Gaza at the UN level, and what are we witnessing? And is this situation comparable to anything that you have seen before in your career?
No, I mean, this is a genocide being televised before our very eyes, and we see the double standards of the West. I mean, if genocide wasn't enough, we have now this incident with UNRWA, which is effectively the identity of Palestinians. I mean, the grandfathers, the fathers, and the sons of the people who faced the Nakba, the catastrophe in 1948, and who want to call themselves refugees or internally displaced from their houses, from their homes, and they need this title to have their identity being placed in history. Now, what Israel is effectively wants to do, and has been trying to do for a very long time, is to deny the role of UNRWA, to disband it, and to have an organization like the UNHCR, just to call them just call them general refugees or people who are stateless or something like that. So, this is more tragic than the genocide itself. It wants to deny Palestinians of their very identity as refugees within their own home.
So the attacks on UNRWA are not, this is not the first time that Israel has said that this organization is really a thorn in its side, right? Can you maybe explain a little bit why is it that UNRWA is in charge of delivering humanitarian relief efforts and not the UNHCR?
So when after 1948, there was an acute issue of the local population, the Palestinian population, being effectively forced out of their homes. And so to address this, the United Nations then established UNRWA with the objective of facilitating the survival of the Palestinians within the Palestinian occupied territory. So the UNHCR effectively came about 10 years later, I mean 5 or 6 years later, with the adoption of the Convention on Refugees, and it catered effectively to refugees from the First World War, and with a subsequent protocol in 1967. This expanded to every refugee person throughout the world. So UNRWA is effectively the predecessor to every refugee convention, and is specific to Palestinians because under the Geneva Convention for the Refugees, they will probably not be encompassed because these are people who fled their habitual place of residence because of fear of persecution, whereas Palestinians have remained within their territory under a regime of apartheid. So therefore, they are internally displaced, but you wouldn't necessarily call them refugees under the Refugee Convention. So UNRWA is not only a machinery, a mechanism for the protection of these people, but it's also a point of reference for who they are, and that is people displaced from their homes but living in that territory.
So if this attack on UNRWA succeeded in actually dismantling the entire UNRWA system, that would mean it would actually rob the Palestinians of their status under international law. Is that the case?
Exactly. And so the outcome of this would be that they would be stateless people, just like the Bedouins, for example, in Kuwait and so forth, who are not recognized, necessarily by their state, but who don't really have a status of citizens. So they can be, you can do whatever you like with them. And so the ideal thing that Israel would do with these people would be to free Gaza of Palestinians, so therefore they wouldn't be able to come back. And so they would be kind of stateless people without the right to return, and which is what the Palestinians want. They want to have the status of refugees or people who have the right to return. And if UNRWA is disbanded, then they would just be stateless people without any land to return to. And that is exactly what they don't want to happen.
Doesn't this entire situation now fly straight into the face of the International Court of Justice, which on Friday ruled that Israel has to make sure that mass dying doesn't occur anymore?
It is, and we knew about the situation of UNRWA, for example, after the 8th October attacks, it was clear. But of course, Israel and its allies chose to keep it just in case something like a ICJ order came about to kind of blur the atmosphere and try to do exactly this, which they're effectively doing. But these are absolutely double standards and flies in the face of the ICJ's order.
But the ICJ ruling was surprising on several levels. Maybe let's first talk about the fact that there is no the court did say that it is competent. It said it is this is clearly under the Genocide Convention, and there is reasonable ground to believe that genocide might be going on. And then it has these provisional measures. Now, the provisional measures do not include what South Africa asked, which is a direct call for a ceasefire. This is something that disappointed me, but how did you interpret that part of the ruling?
It's a good question, Pascal. Before I say that, let me just say that the order is addressed to Israel, okay, and to some degree to Hamas, but it's quite small. But it's not addressed to the allies of Israel. So this UNRWA incident is effectively a way of bypassing the order through the actions of other states. Okay, so committing genocide, continuing the genocide, but not through Israel, through other states. So when Israel has to report back in a month to the ICJ, it's not going to report on the actions taken by these other allies to effectively starve the Palestinians to death because of the disbanding of UNRWA and not providing any money to it. But going back to your question, I think when the ICJ, never in the history of the ICJ have we seen an order or judgment that kind of justifies or provides every claim made to an applicant. Because if it did that, if it gave everything to an applicant, then it would alienate the other side and its allies from the court. And it's always, the court is always reminiscent of this. That we've seen, this is an era of proliferation of international court tribunals, and it's not out of the question that an entity as a tribunal will just die one day. And we've seen that with the South African Development Community Tribunal, which just completely disbanded within a day because Zimbabwe didn't like one of its judgments. And so, this is not out of the question. And so I think the court was leaning towards Palestine, but without using the word ceasefire, without, effectively taking on board South Africa's request. But it doesn't really make any difference, in my opinion, because if you effectively accuse a country of committing genocide and the genocide is ongoing, it's absolutely clear it's not going to stop. So even ordering the ceasefire doesn't make any difference, in my opinion. I think it's hard enough for Israel to be accused of genocide, and the implications, political and legal, that actually follow from this.
The other fascinating thing to me was that there were 17 judges on the panel, right? The 15 permanent ones plus one appointed by Israel, one appointed by South Africa under the procedures, and the rulings or the measures that the court voted for were reported in like who voted for what, right? And most of the 6 or 7 measures were voted for 15-2, and some of them even 16-1, which then included the Israeli judge or the Israeli appointed judge voting alongside his colleagues and actually saying like, yeah, we need provisional measures, which means that this judge actually also recognizes that there's probably genocide going on, or there's reasonable grounds to believe that genocide is going on. Is that a fair interpretation? And do you think that this very strong mandate has any future implications for legal cases against Israel?
Yeah, I think this is very embarrassing for Israel. I mean, even its own judge on the 2 of the 6 provisional measures voted in favor, and he recognized that there is a case for genocide. And I have to be honest, I don't think Israel expected that. Because Ehud Barak is a very experienced judge in Israel, a member of the Supreme Court. He's ruled in favor of the fact that Gaza was under an occupation. Therefore, Israel had human rights obligations towards Gaza. This was in the Bassiouni case. But of course, he's also the same judge who allowed illegal settlements to take place in the West Bank. So, it's a bit controversial, but I would say overall he's a standard, and he's a very good judge, and someone who, under circumstances, is less biased than we would expect. The other judge, of course, who did not rule in favor was someone, had I not been given her name, I would not know that she existed, nothing extraordinary about her career, about her scholarship or anything of that nature. And as I understand it, she belongs to a kind of extreme evangelical group that believes the Armageddon is close, and so therefore Israel should have the promised land. And her comments were just, it was out of a failed 1-year, first-year student exam in international law, that this is a political dispute, not a legal dispute. I mean, how is that possible when the ICJ has made it clear what is a legal dispute since the Mavromatis Palestine concessions case. And here we have a difference of opinion on a genocide convention, on a treaty. And so this is clearly a legal dispute, even if it has political connotations. But you're right that the implications for Israel from an order that has such a huge majority leaning is significant. So one thing would be that parliaments now would be hard pressed to allow aid, whether military or financial, to Israel, and even maybe exports. And I could see individual sanctions from states against Israel, although states will have a hard time convincing the US that this should go on. And at the same time, I don't exclude the possibility of universal jurisdiction being implemented by countries, especially in Africa, and maybe even in Asia. In Europe, I don't think that's going to happen, but there it is.
What does that mean, universal jurisdiction? Could you explain that?
Yeah, so universal jurisdiction means that any country in the world has the right to indict individuals accused of committing serious international crimes, core international crimes, especially crimes against humanity, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, and also genocide. And so irrespective, there's a link with that country and the offenders or the offense itself. And we've seen this happen in Europe, for example, in the late 1990s and early 2000s with respect to people accused of these crimes in the former Yugoslavia and in Rwanda. And that actually occurred to a significant degree. And also when Belgium adopted its 1993 law on universal jurisdiction, and so it indicted a number of people. So this is plausible for this to happen.
So that this would open up the route for countries to declare universal jurisdiction, and then some group actually accusing Netanyahu of war crimes, and then in that country he could be convicted of war crimes in absentia, and then that would preclude him from ever flying to that place, right? I mean, it would make it off limits.
Exactly. Exactly. And of course, in Europe, if there's one prosecution, even in absentia, but I'm not sure if if there are any if there are any longer any in absentia prosecutions in Europe. I'm not sure. I have to look this up. But if that happens in Europe, we have the European arrest warrant. So and even if there is no prosecution, it's possible that even simply by having an indictment, that a European country may ask from the other 27 member states to extradite the accused without having to produce much further, without any further documentation.
So this means that if we look at the current European mess that it is, that if the most reasonable one, let's say Ireland, decided to implement universal jurisdiction and get an arrest warrant, that it could force the others to actually, follow suit. Is that the?
Yes, yes. So under the terms of the European arrest warrant, and I haven't studied for a number of years, but if I remember correctly, there are no grounds for let's say for refusing to extradite because there's a level of trust within the European Union, and so therefore you can't. I mean, what's the ground? I mean, there can be no ground. So it's embarrassing if a state doesn't kind of extradite the accused. But then, besides the criminal element of that, it also the element of tort. So, if people in Europe or anywhere in the world can accuse an Israeli official for the unlawful acts occurring, and based on the unlawful acts, even if there's no criminal jurisdiction, there's no criminal case against the accused, there can be an element of tort. So asking for damages against those people, and in the as a consequence, freezing Israeli assets in that country.
So do you think that this kind of thing hasn't occurred yet because the ICJ hasn't had a ruling yet, but now that we have it, it's more likely that countries will start going that route, especially countries like South Africa and other humane places on earth?
Could be. I mean, how many Israeli assets in South Africa? I don't think. I mean, private, so they can't go after that. But I see recently that there's been at least one suit in Los Angeles against Biden for complicity in genocide by Israel. So you can be as imaginative as you like to do this kind of stuff, right? So I'm sure there are going to be suits against Israeli officials. I mean, I'm sure others will bring suits against Hamas, but Hamas is just doesn't have any assets anywhere that are. But I wouldn't put it against the United States to try and kind of link individuals it doesn't like with Hamas and say, yeah, your assets can be seized. But this is going to be a long playing game with suits in major jurisdictions.
But it is a game that also empowers certain human rights groups on the ground, right? I mean, you don't need to be a state to bring these allegations now against Israel. You can be an NGO and maybe use universal jurisdiction. How I perceive that one part of this entire horrendous atrocity that's going on is also connected to the status of the United Nations. We have seen that the UN did not go along and did not vindicate Israel time and time again, from the very beginning. After week number 4 or 5, I think the UN Secretary General actually said the attacks didn't happen in a vacuum. That really angered Netanyahu very much. And now the ICJ, which is another organ of the UN, is actually siding with the Palestinians. Do you think that what we are seeing now is also starting to be an attack on the UN system itself?
I think that Israel has made it clear from the very beginning that not just from this event, but generally, that it doesn't trust the UN as an institution. And we've seen that from the appointment of the investigative team back in the early 2000s, looking at Operation Cast Lead and all these things. And and even one of the members was Jewish. Forget the South African name. Was it Goldstone? Richard Goldstone, right? So I mean, Israel doesn't hide its antipathy and its hatred for the UN, but it's very selective. I mean, when the UN does something for Israel, it just says nothing. But overall, it doesn't like the UN to exist. I mean, we have two institutions in the UN that Israel hates, but in particular, UNRWA that we mentioned, which Israel would like to kill it if it could, and also the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of in occupied Palestinian territories. It doesn't like that term. Whatever it is, it doesn't agree that there are occupied territories. Its opinion is that this shouldn't exist either. And of course, we have the General Assembly is dominated by liberal states. We have a past of colonialism and so forth. So nothing is in its favor, within the global South. And the EU countries are generally, ambivalent about what they choose, depending on the circumstances. So yeah, Israel would like the UN to go away. That's absolutely for sure.
And can you in any way explain to yourself how it is that so many European countries are just going along with Israel's claims, and that the maybe not the legal space. We're now seeing that the legal space actually provides some form of level playing field and does exactly what it is supposed to do. But the media space in Europe is horrendous at the moment. Can you explain to yourself how this double standard and this hypocrisy that you already talked about, where this is coming from?
Well, the Israeli propaganda machine is vast. And I think people in Europe are not really aware of how vast it is. So just to give an indication, I think during the war now in Gaza, I think something like between 60 and 100 Al Jazeera journalists have been killed. I mean, that's just that you can't make up this number. You just cannot make up this number. And we know for sure that Israel targets Al Jazeera journalists. And 2 years ago, Shireen Abu Akleh, who was who's a Christian, she was
American.
doing an innocuous shooting of events, and an Israeli sniper shot her in the head, and Israel said, we're not going to investigate this, as it usually does. So an army assassinates a reporter, and it's no news, it's nothing. So and a few years ago, there was Al Jazeera did an investigation, and it infiltrated a lobby group in the UK. I think in the UK for sure, and then I'm not sure if it was in the US as well. And so as a result of that, it had filmed secretly a number of discussions, and so Israel and the United States personally intervened a day before this was out to stop it from being aired. I'm not sure what happened after that. I just was watching the part of it this morning. Now, one of the things that came out of this was that these lobby groups were picking out members of parliament in the UK to eliminate, to take them out, not to kill them, but to slur them with any accusation, and so to remove them from their office. And then one of the leaders of the lobby group made it clear that, and jokingly, of course, but jokingly, as in, how easy it is. He says we're using the term anti-Semitism as a way of blurring every discussion about Israel.
Yeah.
So this is it. I mean, this is it. So anti-Semitism becomes one of those things that you can level against anyone simply to stop discussion against Israel, and we see that in the United States. We see it everywhere. So of course, journalists in the UK and Europe are afraid to report things. The media is dominated by this propaganda, and so I just don't see a way out except for independent media on the internet.
And the situation must be different, though. You're in Qatar, right? In the Arab-speaking world. What is the mood in Qatar about what's going on? I mean, one of my Iranian friends told me that the mood in Iran, some Iranians hate their own government so much that whenever something that happens against their own government, they think it is something positive. And there's actually, he told me, and I can't verify this, but he told me that there's a substantial party in Iran who does not think that Israel is in the wrong, but that, the Palestinian problem is the Palestinian problems and not the Iranian problems, and they just don't want the war with the US. That's it. So leave it at that. What's the feeling in Qatar?
I mean, maybe I should say for your viewers that the Gulf, generally the Gulf, I mean, as opposed to North Africa, for example, is a place where huge amount of sophistication in terms of it's a very modern society. People are dealing with modern issues in the same way that people in New York would deal with issues. So it's a very progressive society to some degree. Some conservatism, but very progressive societies, and this is throughout the Gulf, I would say. So, but people here have a huge interest in what's going on in their neighborhood. I mean, they want peace because they have a lot to lose, without peace. And so within this context, Qatar is playing a leading role in mediation, but we only see the tip of that. Now that Israel, Qatar, Hamas talks and the mediation. How did this happen? Well, because back in 2012, the United States, being a strategic ally of Qatar, effectively demanded, I would say requested, but demanded that Qatar host two organizations in Doha, and that was the Taliban and Hamas. And of course, when this is the case, when the US says something of this nature, Israel has agreed. So this is not outside of Israel's remit. And so with the Taliban, we have Qatar mediated between them because it was clear, even from 2012, that the Taliban would take over. The US realized that it was inevitable. And so a year before the fall of the Taliban, we have the US-Taliban agreement, and that was mediated by Qatar. And so everybody was in shock when the Taliban took over. In the news, the CNN, how did this happen? Well, the US knew about this 10 years before. It wasn't something that just happened one day, from one day to the other. The US wanted simply a way out without, there being another Somalia, another Mogadishu. And this worked well. There was no casualties. I mean, ISIS intervened in the end, but the Taliban tried to protect the Americans leaving. We saw that, and that was based on the US-Taliban agreement. With Hamas, exactly the same. The US had branded by that time in 2012 Hamas a terrorist organization. And what's the outcome of that? Well, you can't speak to them. You can't speak with terrorists. And so the only way to speak with them was by a third-party independent mediator, and that was Qatar, who undertook this role. And we see how well it worked. And Israel is now trying to spin this and saying Hamas supports terrorists. Sorry, Qatar supports terrorists. But you are the ones who agreed through the US to host Hamas so that you can speak to them in the event of a crisis of this nature. And it actually worked. But again, Israel tries to spin everything to its advantage. UNRWA, the presence of Hamas in Doha, and so forth.
A colleague at the Responsible Statecraft the other day drafted a text about the pressure right now on Qatar to basically not switch side, but to kick out Hamas and pick a side and not be a mediator anymore. Do you think that's going on, or is there still some interest from the Americans and the Israelis to actually somehow speak to their arch enemy through Qatar?
I think Qatar had no interest in hosting Hamas here. I mean, Qatar tries to be a global mediator. Its foreign office is a huge, complex organization that as big as perhaps even France or big countries. But it had no interest to do that. And the only way that Hamas will leave is only if the United States requests that Hamas be kicked out. If that's not the case, then Hamas stays because it's in the interest of the United States to do that, and it's also in the interest of Israel to remain. And we saw with the presence of the Taliban here that the kind of the peaceful takeover of the Taliban in Afghanistan meant no more war, no more casualties, and a relative peace restored to the country. And I think it's in the interest of the United States for a two-state solution. Maybe not now, but ultimately this will have to be the case for the sake of Israel and local peace and security, that Hamas is a party to these discussions, and its presence in Doha is required in order for that solution to come about.
But right now, the whole media onslaught and the entire narrative from Israel is that they will fight until the last Hamas person is dead. I mean, that's actually what they say, right? They want to kill each and everyone, and then they wonder why Hamas does not give up, right? Because so the official narrative is a complete, utter eradication of Hamas, and then the fig leaf and pretense that, oh, Hamas is different from the Palestinians. We just want to kill all the Hamas people, but not the civilians, right? That we know that this is BS. But then why is it that they still actually, on a real political level, want to keep some Hamas there and in place and actually have them in Qatar? Why?
Because there is always, I mean, politics should be a long-term game, not just a short-term vision, right? So you never know why you may need to discuss something with your chief enemy. And here we have the situation where Hamas has taken 130 hostages still. I guess that's the number now. And so you need to be able to bring them back somehow. You need to be able to agree a ceasefire with Hamas. You can't agree with the population because it's just fleeing all the time. So there is still a reason why Hamas is important as a party
actor.
to negotiations.
So do you view the genocide that's being committed right now as something that is for which Israel actually has a long-term plan? Because I mean, I think the only thing that they can aim for, that they're probably aiming for, is to make the situation so horrendously, horribly bad that once Egypt agrees to open the border, everybody will just run. Do you think that's the long-term goal?
Just to give a background to your viewers, I mean, Gaza is a small place with 2 million people. So excuse my language, but it's a shithole. I mean, people were living in dire conditions, even before the war. It's not a nice place to live. It's cramped. There's not enough water. There's not enough food. There's not enough of anything in there. And yet, these people could escape anywhere. I mean, they could go to anywhere and live. They could have a decent life. And yet they choose to stay in there to avoid them becoming stateless and to have a country to go back to, the right to return. There's no other reason why you would stay in there. These are talented people. We see so many talented Palestinians across the globe, academics, lawyers, engineers, you name it, but they choose to stay there. And so I think your viewers should understand that. And the same with the West Bank. In the West Bank, people think it's not as bad as Gaza because they're being bombed and so forth. But from one day to another, Israeli settlers, go into their houses, they kill the people in their houses, and we've seen so many instances of this, and they take over their farms and their houses, and so it's dangerous there as well. But they stay there with exactly the same reason, to avoid becoming stateless and not being able to come back. And so I think this is important as a context. I forgot the first part of your question, Pascal. What was it?
The question was, do you think that Israel will be able to put so much hurt that the ones who survive will flee, will go?
You can see now, I mean, if people wanted to cross over from Rafah to Egypt, they could. I mean, it's not, I mean, who's going to stop them? The Egyptian army would go in and kind of kill them. That's not the case. They wouldn't do that. And so there's a reason why they're not crossing. It's because they believe that even if they stay there within the rubble, that ultimately they will go back in the rubble and take the bricks and mortar, and they will try to build something that looks like a hut, and they will stay there. I mean, that's the goal of these people, to stay in their houses. Of course, Israel wants to eradicate that, and it's an opportunity. And so there's a reason why they're committing genocide. It's so they can push them out from Gaza and take over the land. And what they've been doing in the last 75 years, right? They know it works. That if you take over territory, even if it's annexed and belongs to someone else, little by little, you occupy it a bit more. You throw the people out and you make it ethnically Jewish, and nobody can come back. And that game has worked because it's been backed by the US, the UK, and its other allies. And so this was a golden opportunity to eradicate Palestinians from Gaza at the very least. And within 20 years, I suppose that will happen in the West Bank as well. Yeah.
It's a very slow process of ethnic cleansing that has been going on now for 75 years. And right now we're seeing a high of that, right? But so I will have to teach a class on human rights starting in April. And it's just, do we still have a chance that this can work? I mean, you wrote this beautiful textbook, and I really want to believe that all of the provisions we have and all of the precedents and so on, that they will ultimately come back and help the Palestinians to get justice. But at this moment, it just looks so incredibly bleak. Do you have hope that human rights and international human rights law and humanitarian law will in the end vindicate and win over this cruel injustice?
Pascal, you're right. It's a crisis of international law. It's a crisis of human rights. We saw the same crisis back in 2001, after 9/11, where the idea was kill them all, put them in Guantanamo, take away their rights, and they did that, for a very long time. And we overcame that. I think there needs to be a huge amount of activism in the world. If you look at I'm 53, and when I studied human rights, it was just this is what the provision says, this is what the treaty says, and that kind of dry stuff. But now, human rights and international law has to be infused with politics as well and activism, and it has to become part of what students must do and must learn to do that. They can't just be dry lawyers who are learning from the text and what the text say and what what these new judgments in the European Court of Human Rights say. I think that's not the way to go. If students find that a case from the European Court of Human Rights, and we see many cases now, there was one recently about in Germany about an organization that provided humanitarian aid, went through Hamas, and the court said, this is a criminal organization. Why is that? But the money goes, but Hamas has two wings, the military and the political wing, and nobody else helps the people there other than through the political wing of Hamas to provide food and water and schooling. So we have to fight against the institution, against these courts, against anything, against that we know doesn't work for human rights. And I think this is the way to go. And students, a good exercise for students is to how would you reverse this state of affairs in your country? Heighten media attention, perhaps activism before the courts and so forth. There are ways of doing it, and they can't do this all the time.
There are mechanisms, that's true. I mean, should we also aim, in terms of the creating norms in order to, this genocide, since it's already happening, it's too late to create norms for this one, but use it in order to make it even harder for something like this to repeat by integrating international law even more with national law, which seems to be the best way of putting pressure on politicians. Make sure that you can, on a national court, threaten local politicians if they do something that under international law is highly illegal. Is there room to improve the system?
Yeah, and I think I think most politicians have no balls. That's really the reality. And the only way to get them to do things that they wouldn't do, go out of their comfort zone. Even in my own country, in Greece, we see far-right politicians playing the Jewish card simply because it kind of helps their career. These are people who were neo-Nazis 20 years ago, and now they put a chutzpah and they go and pay homage to Holocaust survivors. So and we see, to their credit, many Jews around the world, I think the majority, right, to be honest, are against this. They've seen genocide. Norman Finkelstein is the kind of the big example here. He's not alone. And in fact, it's not the Jewish people who are in favor of this. It's the right-wing evangelicals in the United States and people of that nature who are completely clueless about what's going on. And I think we need to attack, and I say attack in a philosophical attack and in ideas about what's going on, and educate people more.
I absolutely agree, and I think that's a very good way of ending the interview and keep some hope for the future. Ilias, Bantekas, thank you very much for taking the time today.
Thank you, Pascal. Appreciate it. Thank you.